Look, if you're ever hiking through the Blue Ridge Mountains and the woods suddenly go quiet, I mean dead quiet, like the birds and the crickets all decided to hold their breath at once, you don't stop to take a photo, you don't check your GPS, you put your head down and you walk back the way you came. And if you hear your mother's voice calling your name from a thicket of laurel where no human could possibly be standing, you keep walking. Because in Appalachia, the things that live in the shadows don't have voices of their own. They steal yours. My name is Wyatt. I've lived in these mountains for 44 years. My family has owned the same 50-acre plot in a deep holler near the Kentucky border since the mid-1800s. We're mountain folk, but we aren't superstitious. We're survivalists. We know the difference between a screech owl and something that's trying to sound like one. The first rule my granddad taught me when I was 6 years old was simple. Wyatt, if you hear a whistle coming from the ridge after the sun goes down, you don't whistle back. You lock the door, you draw the curtains, and you don't look out the window until the crows start cawing in the morning. Last November, I broke that rule. It was a Tuesday, around 5:30 p.m. The sun was dipping behind the jagged peaks, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the valley. I was out near the old smokehouse, fixing a loose hinge on the heavy oak door. I had my tools with me, a classic Estwing framing hammer and a bucket of galvanized nails. The air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and damp cedar. Then, the hush happened. 1 second, the wind was rustling the dry oak leaves. The next, the world felt like it had been vacuum sealed. The silence was heavy, pressing against my eardrums like I was underwater. Then, I heard it. Woo-wit-hoo. It was a whistle, 3 notes. Low, melodic, and impossibly clear. It came from the dense line of hemlock trees at the edge of the ridge, about 50 yards up the slope. I froze. My heart gave a sharp, painful thud. It sounded exactly like the whistle my brother Caleb used to call the dogs back in, but Caleb had been dead for 12 years, taken by a flash flood in 08. Wyatt. The voice came from the trees. It was Caleb's voice, not a memory, not a recording. It was his exact tone, that slight rasp he had from years of smoking Marlboros. Wyatt, I'm caught in the laurel. I can't see the path. Help me down, brother. My brain knew it was impossible. My logic centers were screaming that my brother was 6 feet under in the churchyard down in the valley. But my heart is a traitor. For a split second, I forgot the rules. I forgot the stories. I shouted, stepping away from the smokehouse. The silence snapped back. The wind picked up, but it was freezing now, smelling of old, rotted wet leaves and something metallic like raw meat. Yeah, it's me, the voice replied, but this time it was a little too fast, a little too perfect. Come to the ridge, Wyatt. Bring a light. It's dark in here. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my Surefire tactical light. I clicked it on, the 1,000-lumen beam cutting through the gathering gloom. I swept the light across the tree line. I didn't see a person. What I saw were eyes, but they weren't at human height. They were about 9 feet off the ground, tucked high up in the branches of an old, dying hemlock. They didn't reflect the light like a deer or a cat. They were flat white and opaque, like 2 marble billiard balls. And as my light hit them, the thing shifted. It didn't climb down. It unfolded. It looked like a man made of gray, weather-beaten wood. Its limbs were too long, its elbows bending in directions that would snap a human bone. It didn't have a face, just a vertical slit that stretched from where its forehead should be down to its chest. And from that slit, it spoke again. This time, it used my own voice. Caleb, yeah, it's me. Come to the ridge, Wyatt. Bring a light. It was repeating what I'd just said word for word with the exact same inflection of fear in my tone. It was learning me. I didn't wait to see it finish unfolding. I turned and bolted for the cabin, my boots skidding on the frost-covered grass. In the mountains, they tell you never to run from a predator because it triggers their instinct to hunt. But this thing wasn't a predator. It was an anomaly. It was a glitch in the natural order. I reached the porch, my lungs burning, and slammed the heavy oak door shut. I threw both deadbolts and shoved the iron security bar into its brackets. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip the handle of my hammer. The cabin felt safe. Built by my great-grandfather, the logs were thick, hand-hewn cedar. It had survived storms, floods, and over a century of mountain winters, but as I leaned against the door, gasping for air, the hush returned. The sound of the wind outside, the whistle of the mountain breeze through the eaves, simply cut out. Then, a soft thud landed on the roof. It sounded like a heavy branch falling, but then came the scratching. Long, slow, rhythmic scrapes across the shingles. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was moving toward the chimney. Wyatt, why'd you run? It's cold out here. The voice came from the fireplace. It was my mother's voice now, soft, comforting, exactly the way she sounded when she'd wake me up for school. But my mother had been in a nursing home in town for 3 years, and she hadn't spoken a coherent word in months due to dementia. I made some tea, Wyatt, opened the window, let the steam out. I backed away from the hearth, my heart hammering against my ribs. I knew the rules. Don't look out the window, don't answer the voice. I grabbed my phone from the kitchen table, 0 bars, no surprise there. The hush always kills the signal. I moved to the center of the room, away from the walls. In the dim light of my flickering surefire, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was a small gap under the front door, just a 1/4-inch space where the weather stripping had worn down. A thick, translucent, amber-colored fluid was slowly oozing through that gap. It smelled like copper and wood rot. As I watched, the fluid didn't just pool on the floor, it started to vibrate. Small ripples moved through it, and then the fluid began to take shape. It wasn't forming a body, it was forming words. Small, raised letters made of that amber sludge spelled out on my floorboards. Give us the whistle. I realized then that the thing on the roof wasn't just trying to get in, it was trying to get me to complete the cycle. In Appalachian folklore, a mimic can't fully take you until you acknowledge its presence or mimic it back, by calling out Caleb. Earlier, I'd given it a foothold. Now, it wanted the whistle. Suddenly, the scratching on the roof stopped, total silence for 10 seconds. Then, from the kitchen, I heard the sound of my own tea kettle. A high-pitched, piercing whistle, but I hadn't turned the stove on. The kettle was cold and empty on the counter. I looked toward the kitchen. Standing in the doorway was me. It was a perfect replica of myself, wearing the same flannel shirt, the same grease-stained jeans. But its skin was slightly translucent, and its eyes, those flat, white, opaque marble eyes, were staring right through me. The Wyatt in the doorway didn't move its lips, but the kettle whistle was coming from its throat. It was getting louder, sharper, until my ears began to bleed. I raised the Estwing hammer, my vision blurring from the sonic pressure. It tilted its head, a sickening crack echoing in the room as its neck bent too far. It opened its mouth, a wide, dark, vertical slit, and spoke in a composite voice. It was Caleb, my mother, and me, all speaking at once in a horrifying harmony. The thing took a step forward. It didn't walk, it glided, its feet never touching the floorboards. I didn't think, I acted on pure ancestral instinct. My granddad had always said that if the mountain tries to swallow you, you don't fight it with steel, you fight it with the things it can't understand. The Wyatt thing was inches away now. The smell was overpowering, like a wet grave that had been opened after a century. I could see the grain of its skin. It wasn't skin at all. It looked like the gray, petrified bark of a hemlock tree. I didn't swing the hammer at its head. I knew that would be useless. Instead, I reached for the heavy cast iron skillet sitting on the wood stove. It was still warm from the morning's bacon. I didn't hit the creature. I slammed the skillet down onto the amber fluid that was spelling out words on my floor. The moment the warm iron touched that sludge, the creature let out a sound that wasn't a voice. It was the sound of a forest fire, the roar of 1,000 trees cracking and burning at once. The rules go both ways, I screamed, my voice cracking. I grabbed a handful of coarse rock salt from the jar on the counter, the kind we use to cure hams, and I threw it into the dark vertical slit of its mouth. In Appalachian lore, salt isn't just for flavor, it's a grounding agent. It forces the spiritual to become physical. The replica's form began to buckle. The translucent skin turned opaque, then brittle. It started to flake off like dry paint. The hush in the room shattered. Suddenly I could hear the wind again. I could hear the old timbers of the house groaning. But the mimic wasn't finished. It grabbed my wrist with a hand that felt like a frozen branch. "You think salt stops the mountain?" It rasped, its white eyes turning a deep bloody red. "We were here before the salt. We were here before the trees. You're just a guest, Wyatt, and your reservation is up." I felt the bones in my wrist start to grind. The pressure was immense. With my free hand, I grabbed the heavy Estwing hammer and, instead of hitting the creature, I drove the claw end of the hammer deep into my own palm. The pain was white-hot, blinding. But the moment my blood-fresh, warm human blood hit the floor, the creature recoiled as if I'd splashed it with acid. In these hollers, there's an old blood pact. The land belongs to those who bleed for it. By shedding my own blood on my own floorboards, I was restaking my claim. I was telling the mountain that I wasn't just a guest, I was the owner. The creature dissolved. It didn't fall, it simply unraveled into a pile of gray dust and dry leaves. The amber fluid evaporated into a foul-smelling mist that was quickly sucked up the chimney. The aftermath, I sat on that floor until the sun came up, my hand wrapped in a torn dishcloth, watching the dust motes dance in the morning light. I checked the roof that morning. There were no scratches, no broken shingles, but the old hemlock tree at the edge of the ridge, it was dead. Completely bleached white, as if it had been struck by lightning, even though there hadn't been a storm in weeks. I can't leave the holler now, that's the catch. When you stake a blood claim against a mimic, you're tied to the land. If I cross the creek that marks my property line, I can feel the hush starting to settle back into my ears. I can hear Caleb's whistle calling me from the distance, and I know that if I step off this soil, I'm fair game, so I stay. I keep my wood stove hot, my salt jars full, and my ears closed. If you're ever driving through Appalachia and you see a man standing on a porch, staring at the tree line with a hammer in his hand, don't wave, don't honk, and for God's sake, don't whistle. Just keep driving until you see the neon lights of a city. And it's getting very, very good at sounding like you.